their authority over the places that they rule. Machiavelli comes later. Machiavelli comes later in the Renaissance period, but there's a lot of Machiavellian politics going on in Europe. States are aligning with each other, and there's intrigue and drama. So here we have the remnants of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire split into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and the Emperor Constantine founds Constantinople, which is Istanbul, which is here, and the Western Roman Empire collapses before the Eastern Roman Empire. Byzantium is the Eastern Roman Empire, and it still is a very strong and powerful kingdom around this time, empire really. And Istanbul is called Constantinople at that stage, but you've got this split in the church of the Western Church, the Catholic Church, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church that has its center in Constantinople. And then you've got the rise of Islam. You've got the Islamic states control the Holy Land, and they also control southern Spain. Islam is the Arabic and Islamic world is the more relevant repository of human learning at this stage. Mathematics, science. The Islamic countries are much more advanced than the European countries that had collapsed into the Dark Ages. And there are great libraries in Muslim Spain that through communications, you got a part of southern France here, southwestern France, where you've got really the beginning of the Renaissance learning. And there's a case to be made that the Western knowledge emptied out of Western Europe with the collapse of the Roman Empire, and it was conserved and grown upon by the world of Islam. And then what we know as the Renaissance was in many ways that knowledge coming back through the Islamic world. And Spain, you've got both Christians and Jews and Muslims living largely in peace with each other, largely. And there's the transference of knowledge that finds its way to Italy, and then you have the Renaissance. So with Francis, you've got it's pre-Renaissance, but you're starting to see the development of the Renaissance. Francis growing up as a young boy in Assisi in the late 1100s, and this is probably no different than many other times in life or in history. What's a young boy to aspire to? And in his case, it was to becoming a knight. The Crusades have been going for 100 years or so. They're finishing off on the Third Crusade, and the Fourth Crusade hasn't been yet announced or hasn't yet been set out by the Pope. But young men are inspired by a few things, a few models of what it means to be a man. One is to be a knight in shining armor, going off to the Holy Land and liberating it from infidels, and getting the woman, the beautiful woman. Also in southwest France, you've got the troubadours, and the troubadours are these musicians and poets that are giving rise to a lot of music and poetry and literature, very romantic. It fits in with being the knight in shining armor. This is all very seductive to Francis. This is what he aspires to. He's the son of a wealthy textile merchant who lives in Assisi. And the textile merchant, his father, goes around Europe, particularly to France, because France is a more stable and wealthier part of Europe, bringing back these beautiful, rich textiles, which he then sells throughout Italy. But he brings back with him not only the textiles, but the stories of what's going on in other parts of Europe. So it's all very interesting to a young boy growing up. There's a few things happening in southwestern France. There's some new branches of, at least from their perspective, branches of Christianity. The Albigensians and the Waldensians. These are people who start formulating their own ideas about what it means to be a Christian. And largely their thinking is similar to the Gnostics. They have this view that all things earthly are flawed and all things spiritual are divine. And so there's this split or this dichotomy between the earth, which is broken and sinful, and the spirit, which is divine and holy. And these, at a later stage, are announced to be heresies. But there's not only the spiritual changes here happening down in southwestern France, but this has ramifications for the politics. You've got these towns that are getting wealthier, and as they're getting wealthier, they want more autonomy from the king or the duke. And so there's the spiritual, but there's also the temporal divisions that are going on. After the Fourth Inquisition, so this is a little bit later, but it has its genesis in the time of Francis. After the Fourth Crusade, there's then, which is in the Holy Land, I'll speak a little bit about it later, you have then a crusade which is internal to Europe, which Pope Innocent III announces. And that is a crusade against the Waldensians and the Albigensians in France. So, and that has the genesis or the seeds of what then becomes the Inquisition later in Europe. So the political situation is very fluid and it's a difficult time. So Francis's baptized name was actually John, or Giovanni. It's his Giovanni Bernardone. He's born in 1182, and his father loved all things French, because France was where his beautiful textiles came from. So he called him Francesco, which really means Frenchy or Frenchman. And that's what he became known as. His early life, he was handsome, charming, well-educated. So he has this aspiration to be a knight, and there's a town not far from Assisi called Perugia. And Perugia and Assisi have ongoing conflicts with each other. And Francis, and you have to be wealthy to be a knight, because you pay for your own horse, you pay for your own armor, you pay for your own arms. So because his father is wealthy, he kits out in his knight's kit, and he goes into battle between Assisi and Perugia. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the perspective we take, Assisi lost that battle, and Francis was imprisoned in Perugia for a year, and he was sick. They think he got malaria. And so he had time to reflect on how this ideal of manhood was working out for him, to be the knight and to be romantic and get the woman and all the rest of it. And he's humbled, so he is. Well, this jumps to the next thing. So he comes back from Perugia. His father pays a large amount of money to get him out of the prison. And he comes back to Assisi. And he's in a point of transition between the seductiveness of the world, this idea that he has of being a knight and getting all the ladies, and then this other idea of another kingdom, but it isn't clear. And this time of transition is quite a few years. So Francis goes down to this so Assisi is halfway up this beautiful hill, and then down in the valley in this unprotected area there are some other buildings, and there's an old church, San Damiano, St. Damian's. And it's fallen into disrepair, so nobody lives there. And it's an old church. Francis goes down and lives there while he's trying to decide what's going on in life. And he prays a lot. And while he's praying, there's a cross there. And the cross is, it's a Eastern Orthodox style cross, or Byzantine style of art. And while he's praying, a voice comes from the cross, and the voice says to him, Francis, rebuild my church. And Francis, of course, is amazed, and he thinks what it means is this church that he's living in, this old broken down church, St. Damian's, that he should physically go and start putting the rocks together and rebuilding it and fixing the roof and stuff. And So he starts doing that and rebuilding the church, but not the symbolism, but the essence of that was of the instruction that he got from his revelation from Christ at that time was to rebuild the whole church and to bring it back to the foundations that the church is built upon, the fruits of the Spirit. So what's interesting too about Francis' time is, so this is the cross. The wonderful thing about this cross is this cross hangs in Assisi. A little later, after the Franciscan order is founded, there is the Order of the Poor Clares, which is like a female version of the Franciscan order. Saint Clare started that. And this cross actually hangs in the Basilica to Saint Clare in Assisi today. You can go and see it. This is the very cross that Francis was praying to when Christ spoke to him. I think that's a pretty cool thing. One thing that's interesting is this cross is obviously very Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox type of, or pre-Renaissance art. It doesn't have dimension to it. It's two-dimensional. But the pictures that I show you here as we go through are pictures that were painted by Giotto in the Basilica of St. Francis after he died, about 60 or 70 years after he died. And you're starting to see the beginning of the Renaissance in European art. You go from this two-dimensional, that's something like my 7-year-old daughter Grace would do. It doesn't have any dimension to it, and it's quite stylized. Whereas this here, Giotto, you're starting to get into more realistic art. You get proportion and perspective. And unfortunately, it's deteriorated over the years, but there's other panels I'll show you. So if you ever go to Assisi, in the Basilica of St. Francis, there are all of these beautiful panels, or murals, that are painted by Giotto and Cimabue, which depict major events in his life. And of course, at this time, not many people were literate. Only the wealthy and only the wealthy and in some respects, the people in the churches were literate. Most people were illiterate. So people acquired information through the spoken word or through looking at pictures. So this is Giotto's panel of Francis praying before the cross and Jesus speaking to him. Francis, rebuild my church. Then we have, Francis gets this. Francis is still living between these two worlds, and he's still the rich man's son, and but he's going around and helping lepers and begging, and giving away these wealthy, beautiful textiles, rich textiles that his family are giving him. And his father gets annoyed with him. Then there's another nobleman who's going off for another crusade, which is loosely connected with the Fourth Crusade. And Francis gets all his kit together, and he heads out from Assisi to go join this nobleman in his crusade. But when he arrives in a town not far from Assisi, Spoleto, he finds out that the nobleman that he's going to join the army of has died, unexpectedly died. And Francis has a dream. And the dream that Francis has, God speaks to him and says, Francis, why do you seek to serve the servant rather than the master? And Francis's reply is, my desire is to serve the master. And the instruction then he gets from God is that I am the master, serve me, which is Jesus. So it's starting to become clearer to Francis that there's these two worlds that he's drawn to, the kingdom of God, or the kingdoms of this world, and things are starting to shake out a little bit. So his venture towards going on that crusade is shot. So then he comes back to Assisi, and anyway, his father gets irate at him. He's a young layabout, and he's living off his family and sharing all their wealth with these poor people and lepers. And the father says, I've had enough of you. And the father, in that day in Assisi, the bishop of Assisi would hold essentially a legal court on a regular basis in Assisi. And the father said to Francis, "You're coming up and we're going to sort this out in front of the bishop, and he's going to decide what's what." So the father drags Francis up to the court and in front of the bishop of Assisi. And Francis makes the choice in the fork in his life. And he says, the father's saying, he should come back, he should work hard, he can inherit the business, but he's got to give up these errant ways. And Francis says, "Well, no, I can't. I have a calling from God to go preach the gospel." And anyway, it's determined that Francis should return everything that belongs to the father to the father. And the only thing that he has that belongs to the father is the clothes he's wearing, which are some nice, rich textiles. So he takes them off and he's naked in front of the bishop. And it's quite a dramatic scene. And he gives the clothes back to the father. And the bishop takes his cloak off and he wraps Francis in the cloak to stop him being naked. And what's interesting is that there's deeper meanings to that. And that is that Francis was a radical for Christ, but he was a radical for Christ within the confines of the orthodoxy of the church. And the cloak that the Bishop of Assisi cloaks Francis in his vulnerability, is the cloak of the protection of the church for Francis's mission for the rest of his life. At the same time that in southwestern France, you have the Waldensians and the Albigensians. They are outside of the orthodoxy of the church, and it's causing a lot of conflict. Francis never criticized the shortcomings of the church. He called people to a more faithful life with Christ, but he didn't come into conflict directly with the church. He played his hand within the orthodoxy of the church. So, in 1209, Francis, with a couple of important protectors, including the Bishop of Assisi and a cardinal, I've forgotten the cardinal's name, he thinks it's wise, with all of the heresies that are going on in Europe, he thinks it's wise that Francis go up and get the blessing of Pope Innocent III in order for things to go well for everybody. So Francis, in 1209, goes up to Rome and has an audience with Pope Innocent III. And Innocent III is a little bit ambivalent about this preacher who's advocating poverty and simplicity, but he sees him and he gives informal. Pope Innocent III gives informal approval for the Franciscan order, but later Pope Innocent III has a dream, and in that dream he sees Francis holding up the church. And Innocent III takes that to be an indication from God that he should do more than just informally sanction the Franciscan order. So in 1210, the church officially sanctions the Franciscan order as an official order of the Catholic Church. Francis was never ordained a priest. He was only ever a deacon. And I think that's an interesting observation. The Franciscan order, Francis took from the Gospel of Matthew, this part of Scripture very seriously. Take no gold, no silver, no money in your belt, no bag for your journey, no 2 tunics, no sandals, nor a staff, but go out and preach the gospel. And he took that literally. He's in some ways like a John the Baptist figure. He's emphasizing repentance, but also kindness, humility, forgiveness, simplicity, gratitude, hard work, and devotion to Jesus. The fruits of the Spirit are in there. He often goes up the mountain to pray in solitude. There's a little church up the mountain from Assisi where he and his followers went to pray. Itinerant preachers, they own no land. They depended on the generosity of the community for food and shelter. They deep reverence for the created world. So this gets a little bit back to the Cathars and the Waldensians, and this idea, the Gnostic idea, that the world is fallen and somehow out of favor with God, and the Spirit is divine and holy. Francis, and the reading of the first chapter of Genesis, as God creates everything, and he says, and it was good. Francis saw the divine in all the created world, which made me think a little bit too about this idea that we have in our American culture of manifest destiny and go out and subjugate the world. That would be in conflict with where Francis saw the divine in all created things. One of the things I liked about him was that at one stage, Francis was a difficult man to follow for the other brothers, because he would go by the seat of his pants a lot and not systemize things and formalize things. And the other brothers would be trying to catch up. And once you've got a large number of people together, you've got to start to have concerns about, well, how are we going to get food for next week? And how can we do this? And what we do if a brother's sick and needs to be treated by a doctor, how are we going to pay them and stuff? And one of the quotes I like about Francis was, as some of the other brothers were advocating, and as people were saying to the Franciscan order, here, you can have this land, we want to gift it to you. He was saying, why do we need to own land? The next thing we'll need is an army to defend it. And so there's this tension, but it's a good tension in Francis's life. The Lord will provide versus good stewardship. There's, you certainly have a feeling that Francis on his journey in life, it's an adventure. And he's always running to catch up as are the other people who are in ministry with him. So in 1219, 1220, Francis goes off to the Muslim lands, and he visits a town, Damietta, I think is the pronunciation for it. Anyway, he encounters the Muslim, he personally goes down to the Muslim lands. This is after the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, which had been sanctioned by Pope Innocent III, had led to the sacking of Constantinople, which was run by Orthodox Christians, just because the Venetians wanted money, and that was the richest city around, and there was a pretender to the throne there. But anyway, the Crusades are doing a lot of things in the name of Christ that are inconsistent with the Christian ethos. So anyway, Francis goes down to the Muslim lands, and while he's down there, before he gets across the line into Muslim occupied territory, he encounters some Spanish crusaders who are all about the infidels and how there's this overwhelming need to destroy them and to liberate the Holy Land. And Francis doesn't have that same dogma about him, and he actually gets into speak to the Sultan, and has a very interesting and worthwhile conversations with the Sultan. One of the things that the Sultan says is it's like a trick. He puts out this carpet full of crosses and asks Francis to walk across it, and Francis does, and the Sultan says, well, why would you walk across the cross? Because isn't that a holy symbol to you? Aren't you desecrating that which is divine? He said, no. He said, I was walking across the crosses of the two thieves that were on either side of Christ. I wasn't walking across the cross of Christ. So I think that's symptomatic for me of a thing that's important about Francis, is he had imagination. He wasn't, sometimes people get burdened by dogma where they lose the ability for imagination, which is at the essence of the mystery of God and the wonder of life, really. And Francis maintained that throughout his life. So he goes to Jerusalem. He actually goes to Jerusalem. There's another story about where he encounters the Sultan in Jerusalem. The Sultan allows him to go to Jerusalem to visit the Holy Land, and at one stage they ask Francis to walk across hot coals, and he does, and it's a measure of his faith, and he's not burned. But so Francis was rigorous, but he was also gentle. He was tender-hearted, but he was also strong. And so he had good relations with the Muslims. He didn't, and that I understand that there's been Franciscans in the Holy Land. They've had a presence in the Holy Land ever since 1219, 1220. The first major scene, again, people weren't very literate, so at one stage Francis drags in some cows and some sheep into Mass, and to demonstrate the earthiness of, and the reality of Jesus being a human being. And people are aghast but surprised, and that then is the genesis of the nativity scenes that we have in all of our churches. It grows quickly then across the Catholic Church to have nativity scenes. Greccio, that was in. This is an example of Francis' writing, which we can read together. The Canticle of the Sun, written in 1224, shows his reverence for all God's creation. Most high, all-powerful, all-good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong. No mortal lips are worthy to pronounce your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother, Son, who brings the day, and you give light through him. And he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In the heavens you have made them bright, precious, and beautiful. And he goes on about wind and air and Sister Water. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Water. She's very useful and humble and precious and pure. Brother Fire. So there's a reverence for the created world that he finds God in without he's not praying to the created world, he's praying to God through the created world. Towards the end of his life, he develops the wounds of Christ from the cross. In his hands and his feet and on his side, he starts bleeding from those points. And for a couple of years, so he would bind up those wounds. And in 1226 he dies. In 1228 he's already made a saint. And by the time he dies, there's more than 5,000 friars all over, mostly Western Europe. So his order has been growing very, very fast. And that's. I'm going to bring this up here again. That's a vignette of Francis's life, and I thought I'd have.
He's filming.
Yes.
Do you think are all those stories true?
Sure. It's a good question. Are all those stories true?
Did he really walk on coals and not burn his feet?
Lots of people still do.
Yeah.
Maybe he did. I don't know.
It's a good question. Jason, you had an answer for that
Oh.
question.
Well, a lot of people walk on coals, and it kind of hate to burst the mythological bubble, but there's really scientific reasons for why people can do things like that. You know, there's this, they discovered that when you do something like that, the sweat on your feet, because the coals are so hot, creates a bead of vapor underneath that protects your skin. So you're able to walk across without burning yourself. Once that's gone, then you start to burn. But you can walk across a good 40, 50 feet of coals sometimes before.
There you go. There's your answer.
Well, maybe he did.
Let me say, I've heard this from many sources. I've never done it myself.
Yes.
This is so germane to our present Pope.
Yeah.
And number two, this week is the Festival of St. Francis. I don't know if that was part of your bringing this. And number two, the Pope just returned. Number three, the Pope lifts up Francis as he and Jesus, you know. And then what's rather interesting with your two kingdoms, that's Augustinian or Luther, and he's lifted up this week. But my other great saint is St. Augustine, which
who also wrote and led a dissolute life before
Right,
he came
and
to
I
God.
see all
Yeah.
that's happening now, and
Mm-hmm.
the way he is kind of forsaking, the expression this week he used was a heavy language attacking the court of the papacy, and the leprosy of the papacy is the word he used.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the wealth.
Mm-hmm. You know, you go back to the Gospels and you go back to Jesus, the itinerant preacher who had no place to live, and the Pharisees, and I think that dichotomy exists in different forms throughout time, and I do find it interesting. Luther and Francis, I find some interesting parallels and some interesting differences. They're both reformers. One, and I think Luther's heart's desire was to reform within the church, but the church rejected Luther, and I think that was a missed opportunity. But they both of them appreciated the grace of God rather than these human constructs of all of the rules and regulations that go along with things. And Francis found it possible to be obedient to God whilst also being largely obedient to the church. And obviously Luther didn't find it possible to be obedient to God whilst also being obedient to the church. And but it's interesting to me, this is the late 1100s, that really for the next 300-400 years, these same issues are playing out of orthodoxy, and the Inquisition has its genesis here, and then the differences between the Muslim world and the Christian world. Don?
Yeah, Carl talked about Pope Francis. What's interesting is the Jesuits almost disappeared because many of the popes several hundred years ago had absolutely no use for them, and they wanted to drive the Jesuits out, and they almost disappeared. Another thing is Francis, from what I'm reading about him, I did read the biography of John Paul I, who was pope for just 33 days. And many of my Catholic friends still to this day believe that he was murdered. He is almost exactly a carbon copy, because John Paul I was one of these people that said, why do we have gold crosses and artworks in the Vatican when our brothers have no beds to sleep in?
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to change that. He was a man for the poor. He was the first pope to actually go out in the streets of Rome. They said, you can't do that. They're mugs, they're muggers, they're thieves. And the people absolutely adored him when he went out and touched them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Francis, we had some people from Brazil stay with us in our home, and they were thrilled to death because they've known him as a cardinal for a long, long time, and they said he is a man who loves the poor, and he will work for the poor for their dignity. And I thought that was terrific. Sounds like the same.
One difference between Francis and I think the ideas of the Waldensians and the Albigensians, I think that it may well have been that Francis's father, who would go to France to buy these wealthy textiles, brought some of those ideas back to Francis, and it helped to inform his faith of living simply and being more authentic to the Gospels. But he found a way to do that within the church, and I think that helped to renew the church. So I did. Perhaps it's a similar time of renewal now under Pope Francis with the church, but those things that are pleasing to God will be cultivated, and those things that are not pleasing to God will be set aside. Yes.
Was his reverence for the natural world original to him, or was that a part of the influences on him from groups and the times?
It's a good question. A lot of people were getting in trouble as heretics around this time, particularly itinerant preachers who were in the mold of John the Baptist, telling, one of the references for the for the Catholic Church is the third estate, that the order of things was maintained by the church. And there was unjust things in society at this time where people would say, well, the church is just perpetuating that injustice. And so there's a need to not only confront the temporal order, but also the spiritual order of things. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that people would get in trouble for seeing the divine in the created order of things. Because even we read the Old Testament, and there's the Hebrews, and then there's the Canaanites and others. And there's a difference between those who pray to Mother Earth, or to items that are held up by the Hebrews to be false gods because they are representations of God. And the whole issue of birth and life. Jason? Mm-hmm.
You also have the sort of height of Augustinian and Neoplatonic influence of the church before the time of, in fact, just before the time of Thomas Aquinas, who brings back Aristotelian thought into the church, where Augustine, who is indebted to Plato, is quasi-dualistic in the sense that although there's never any official denunciation of the created order, it is definitely downplayed, and it is less than that we are human beings are separate from the creation by virtue of their everlasting souls, and that these should be always and only ordered toward God, so that devotion to God through natural created things is at the very least suspect.
Yeah, so that is suspect at that time, and there are people who are going about who are getting killed because they're held to be heretics, and it isn't always because they're heretics, it's because they're threatening the established order of things.
Yeah, there was one, I can't recall his name, but I just recently read a book on the Borgias, who were actually enlightened me because I had no clue that they were Spanish. But it was at a time when you had all of the papal states, and in the southern kingdom of Italy was ruled by the French, was ruled by the Spanish, and ruled by the Germans, you know, off and on through all of these times. And the papal states were actually like city-states that were ruled by families. You know, call them a godfather, if you will, but they were named families, and these guys were rough citizens. And there was one individual during that time, there were two Borgia popes that I read about, and he was one that preached that, you know, strict adherence to the gospel, and he eventually got himself in trouble and was executed, but
So that's the risk that you ran in talking about how I see the divine in the sun and the stars and the so I'm not an authority on all things Franciscan. What resonates for me about Francis is the timelessness of his faithfulness, and that's something I find very attractive. There's a story in one of the biographies that I read of in the early days when Francis has completely shed his allegiance to the kingdom of this world, but he's still in a point of transition where he hasn't established his order and stuff. And the local townsfolk in Assisi are saying, come on down to the main road because the Holy Roman Emperor is coming by. He's on his way to Rome to see the Pope to get papal sanctioning for some detail of state or other. And Francis says, no, I have my work to do in rebuilding this little church, San Damiano. And they were saying, oh, you're crazy. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing to see Frederick II, or whoever it was, come by in all his regal glory. And I find that instructional for us, that But there's Francis, who, from a temple perspective and putting the rocks together in that old broken down church, is doing something, he's living a life that has eternal significance. And here we are, almost 1,000 years later, talking about Francis. And there's probably very few people in this room who could even tell who the Holy Roman Emperor was at that time in 1204. But in his day, the Holy Roman Emperor was the most powerful man in Western Europe. And, you know, here today we've got, you know, third or fourth most important city in our country, San Francisco, named after Francis. The Franciscan order is still going strong. And that resonates with me because it touches all the way back to Jesus and how we're still reading about somebody who was alive 2,000 years ago, who lived his life in a certain way that we're called to live our lives in that way too. And I think that's one of the things that leads us to Francis as a signpost towards the one that we seek to follow, which is our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So, yeah.
I don't know if this helps, but I studied by Luther under Jesuits that taught at our Lutheran seminary. And the word doctrine, in its root word that I learned from the Jesuits, comes from the same word as doctor, healing. And those in the Reformation tradition that came out of the German tradition embraced that emphasis of healing the breach, where in Germany it became doctrine separated you of what you were against, and it became kind of something that you identified or pulled away from. And the Jesuit gift of using doctrine, today it's the Jesuits, you know, comes out of Francis, is this creative force, organicness of doctrine, openness to learning, to where today, because of Francis, the largest educational institution on earth is the Jesuits, all over the world. And I don't think we sometimes know that, what a gift Francis was.
There's a phrase that's credited to Francis, but probably did not originate with him, and that is, I preach the gospel every day, and occasionally I use words.
Oh.
And that phrase didn't come till like 300 or 400 years after Francis had died. But, and I remember Dennis McBride was the first person I've ever heard say that. But whether it came from Francis's mouth or not, I think an authentically Christian life lived is a compelling invitation for others to follow God, to follow the gospel. And too often, for all of us, myself included, we use words. We use words without the actions, and words can be cheap, but actions are compelling. And I think the way Francis lived his life, that was the compelling thing that drew so many, and still draws many people to him. He lived his life authentically as a disciple of Christ, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So I do. Yes.
Yeah, Connor, to show you how that during those times the Pope was the most powerful man on earth, and the leverage that he had was excommunication, which was worse than death for even the royalty. But to show you how powerful he was at one of the Popes, and I don't know if it was one of the Borgias or not, but I had read this, that he was at odds with the Hohenstaufen, which was a dynasty, a German dynasty. And when the king died, he took all the children and had them executed, and that was the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. That's how powerful the Pope was at that time.
And Pope was powerful, but also the Pope was constrained. This reminds me of the Psalms, where David writes the Psalms. And so David's a powerful and successful king, but it's darn hard to keep control of people who are, some of whom are out to get you and or are dissatisfied no matter what you do for them. And I think the Pope found himself at this time in a similar predicament. He had all these dukes and kings and queens coming seeking his approval for this, that, and the other, and they were all doing these unusual alliances to try to gain control over these different kingdoms. And I think the Pope was as much a trapped by his circumstances as he had this power that you were speaking about.
He was elected by the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, not the cardinals. He created this alliance.
So this terrible thing happens. Pope Innocent III sanctions the Fourth Crusade. It's supposed to go down to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Lands, but the Venetians, who are the big naval power at the time, build this huge fleet on the promise of getting a ton of money for participating in the Fourth Crusade. And there's some pretender to the Byzantine court who tricks them and says, you know, Constantinople is the wealthiest city in Christendom. If we go to Constantinople and you present me as the new king, we'll be fated with open arms, and I'll give you all the money that's in the treasury, which was a ton of money. So, but Constantinople and Byzantium is Christian. It's Christian Orthodox, the Eastern Rite, and so there's a whole mess of affairs happen. But anyway, there's this armada of crusaders that are supposed to be going to the Holy Land, but the money's in Constantinople. So they take a left turn to Constantinople, and they sack the city in 1204. And they kill and murder and rape and loot the entire city. A city of 500,000 people. And Byzantium never fully recovers after that. The Western Roman Empire struggles through for the next few hundred years, but ultimately falls to the Ottomans. And the same Ottomans who are breathing down the German principalities' necks when Luther is around. And so that terrible event, it was only popes in our recent lifetimes who've apologized to the Orthodox Church for that happening. That the Eastern Orthodox still feel, understandably, very bad about that terrible occurrence. So there are all these bad things happening with, you're talking about the Pope having this power. When the Pope was sending letters to the Fourth Crusade saying, do not sack Constantinople. But the Venetian overlords needed their money. And so they just hid the letters. They didn't share it with the mercenaries and the Crusaders. And so it was a bloody mess, so there was. So we're best to be called, like Francis, to living a simple life and avoiding as much as possible getting caught up in the kingdoms of this world, and being authentic to what Christ's calling is for us. So
I think, hinging on what Carl just said, that was true, that the princes had a lot to do with who was the Pope. And I believe it was Alexander in the 1400s that said that this is enough, and he created the College of Cardinals. Then, of course, you had the popes. They made their nephew a cardinal, they made their brother-in-law a cardinal. The Italians wanted more cardinals than the Spanish, and the French wanted more cardinals than the Italians, and it was a real knotty problem throughout the history of the papacy during those times.
So if you ever have the opportunity to go to Assisi, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful place. It's very peaceful. You get a feeling or a sense for things. You can go see that cross where Christ spoke to, Francis through that cross. It's a wonderful place to go to if you're so fortunate.
Is that the town?
Yeah, the town's up here on the right, and then this is at the end of the town is the Basilica of St. Francis that used to be a.
It looks huge.
It is big. It is very big. Pardon?
What's in that big thing?
It's there's a couple of churches, the upper church and the lower church. I don't actually know what else is there. Administrative offices for the order? I'm not sure. A lot of beautiful art in there, so there is. And St. Francis is buried there, and St. Clare is buried in a church that's up in the town, and beautiful views of the surrounding valley and stuff. It's wonderful. Well, thanks a lot for your time, and hope you learned
Close
something.
with the prayer of St. Francis.
Oh, sure, you wanna do that?
Well, I don't know if I know it all.
The prayer of St.
I got
Francis.
it in my book. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's a couple more where there are. Where there is sorrow, joy.
That's pretty good.
I used to say it every day, and then I got out of hand.
Hey, Connor,
Yes,
while you're looking that up,
yes,
am I doing that for my class next week?
sure.
Many of my classes are
So I'd still like to invite everybody to think about coming out for that. If you miss one or two,